We're live. Hello. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very, very many reasons. Uh, Unfortunately, today I have a slight cold, which is why my voice sounds differently than it usually does, and why I'm working from a different location than I usually am. If anyone is here and willing and able to mention in the chat, would you please let me know that you can hear me all right? I'm using a different microphone than I have in the past, and I tested it all out. It should be working fine, but it would be great to have some confirmation. So anybody who is willing and able to let me know in the chat if you can hear me, that's appreciated. This is not therapy. What it is an open conversation. It is like any conversation. Whenever people are paying attention to one another, everything we're observing in each other impacts us, right? So whatever, if you're paying attention to me, anything I'm saying and doing is impacting you in some way, sparking thoughts, prompting responses, causing you to have different feelings and reactions in different ways. And the same is true in reverse. Now, until and unless you are participating in our chat, which I'll mention in a moment, I'm just doing my best to imagine who you might be, who might be here watching this stream, and I will be doing my best to say things that I think are of interest and say them in ways that I think will be understandable and accessible. If you are willing and able to participate by putting messages into the chat, that's very much appreciated. It helps me to get a lot more information about who you are and what you're interested in. So this is a conversation, and that can mean that it can be questions and answers, but it can be like any other conversation. Whatever you say, I'm going to be noticing it. It impacts what I think, what I feel, what I do, and vice versa. I work with a practice called Effective Artistry. You can see the logo there in the corner. The office is located in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, and family therapy with people who are in the state of Illinois. We also work with a couple of executive functioning coaches who work with people all over the world via the internet. We specialize in a neurodiversity affirming approach, which does mean that we quite frequently work with people who identify as being neurodivergent. But if you've been here before, you've heard me talk about neurodiversity and what it means to be neurodiversity affirming, that it is not about an identity label and that some people are neurodivergent, some people aren't. That's a useful way of using that language, but it's not like we focus specifically on, we only work with people who are neurodivergent. We take a particular approach that utilizes, it is built on top of the worldview that is neurodiversity. We also have some specialty dealing with executive functioning issues and etc. If you're interested, you can look up the website effectiveartistry.com. There's information there, including the various different practitioners, and you can reach out to us. But here we are today, and like I said, this is an open conversation, meaning it's like an open office hours. What I'm doing every week is showing up here and being available and present and visible to be able to talk with whomever is here about whatever they want to talk about. I'm going to start talking about stuff just that I think is of interest to share, because it would be, boring and uncomfortable for me to just sit here quietly until somebody says something. And unfortunately, I don't have Caitlin or anybody else joining me today. So I'll be talking about stuff, but if you're here, please don't feel as though you have to stay on the topic or related to whatever it is that I'm discussing. Feel free to put in whatever you would like to put in about anything. We'll go wherever we go. I think that's mostly it. If I'm missing anything, I'm forgetting it now. If it comes to me later, I'll say it later. Like I said, you'll have to excuse me. I have just a bit of a sore throat and very slight congestion. So I'm mostly feeling fine, but it certainly is impacting the way that I sound. And every once in a while, there'll be a cough. And I am, as I hope many people, most people, as I hope are, I'm very careful and cautious about exposing other people to anything, because you never know what other people, what their position might be, and also what I might be dealing with. So thus working from home. But feeling good and happy to be working, happy to be talking, and be, I don't know, maybe bored otherwise. I don't know, maybe not. But especially after last week, having to cancel the stream late. And I was intending to do the stream last week, even though it was a holiday here in the US. But my day just ended up going differently than I expected, and I wasn't able to be available for the stream. I didn't want to skip it 2 weeks in a row. I might be taking drinks more often than not, or more often than usual. And worst comes to worst, if my throat starts to hurt and get irritated from the talking, then I will wrap this up early. Anyway, here we are. This is not therapy hour. What I'm thinking about today, honestly, has a lot to do with illness for obvious reasons, or wellness, maybe, is another way to say what I'm thinking about, but also about the beginning of the school year, because I have 3 young children, 2 of whom I have one third grader and one kindergarten. One just started kindergarten this year, and then one about to be 3-year-old. And so, beginning of the school year, pretty much every year, there's some, everybody's dealing with something, and at different times and whatever. So, everyone in my family thus far has had a little bit of some kind of crud, kind of staggered from one another. So those two things are kind of connected in my mind right now, the beginning of the school year and the fact that I am unwell. We use a term in our culture, mental health, mental illness, mental wellness, mental well-being, that I think is an incredibly useful term, and also, like all things which are useful, has limitations. And when it is utilized beyond its scope, beyond the scope in which it is useful, it can cause problems. Meaning, I try to be clear with people that all of these things, concepts, strategies, ideas, words, everything, these are all tools in every sense of the word, right? They are objects which are intended, which are created for the purpose of being useful for some purpose. And so I like to use the metaphor of physical tools. For those of you who have been here before, you've seen me do a lot of where I'm taking things which are mental, cognitive, emotional, psychological, whatever, and equating them or using metaphors with things that they relate to in the physical realm, because we have a much better understanding of physicality, each of us as individuals, because we observe it every moment of every day that we are awake. We're observing physical things. So cognitive and mental, emotional things, we observe those too, but it's a different. I almost started going down a particular path that I don't know. I don't feel like going down right now. It doesn't seem as useful. Mental health, we call it. And it's useful in the same way that a hammer is a useful tool. With a hammer, you are able to do things that you wouldn't be able to do without the hammer. You're able to do things that you would be able to do without the hammer, but with the hammer, you're able to do them more efficiently, at less cost to you, more safely, less risk of injury, right? It's a very useful tool. And if you attempt to use a hammer to cut a piece of wood in half, not only is it no longer useful, it is going to cause you problems, right? If you try to cut a piece of wood in half with a hammer, you're quite likely to ruin the materials and quite likely to injure yourself. So it's important when we're talking about tools to be specific about the ways in which they are useful and the ways in which they are limited. Otherwise, what ends up happening is somebody hands someone a hammer and says, hey, this tool is really great for letting you build things. And that person gets an understanding of like, okay, then any task that is involved with building stuff, I should use this hammer for. And they go and they start nailing things in, and it's great. But they try to measure something with the hammer and it doesn't work so well. And they try and cut something with the hammer and it really doesn't work. And obviously that's ridiculous. Like I said, I use these physical metaphors to point out how absurd some of these things are. But when it comes to cognitive things, psychological, mental things, we are much more prone to, if somebody says, hey, this is a useful tool, we generalize that and think, oh, it's a useful tool for everything. So mental health, that concept, that language is one of those things. Mental illness is one of those things. These concepts, this language was a very helpful, very useful progression forward from what came before. And it, to this day, provides a lot of utility. When we were, as humans, right, each of us individually, we have very narrow context. None of the science is like 100% settled, but there's fairly solid consensus on these things that can always change with new information. But the scientific consensus is that our specific species first appeared about 200,000 years ago on this planet. Our specific, not our progenitors or, excuse me, ancestors, but our specific Homo sapiens species. None of us know anything really about what happened 200,000 years ago. It's one of these things that kind of evades our ability to conceptualize that span of time. We mostly think about and are aware of things that have happened in the last few years. But really, when we're talking culturally, culture is a way to kind of take things and put them into systems and institutions to continue them on longer than just, a quick here and it's gone. But even culturally, most of us in the United States, especially the vast majority of what we are thinking about and aware of and impacted by, we're talking about less than 100 years into the past. Specifically, World War II and post-World War II in the United States was a pretty huge cultural shift. And then, especially with the development of mass media like television in the 1950s, some things started to lock in. So we don't think very often about going further back. But for this conversation, let's go a little further back, right? Let's start with the concept of mental health, mental illness. The idea that things like depression, anxiety, which these are terms which refer to, everyone understands, they refer to universal experiences, right? We all have times, we all have experiences where we are experiencing anxiety, we are experiencing what we would call depression. But it also is useful to delineate some specific criteria where, like, not everybody experiences those things in the same way, at the same frequency, to the same intensity, same duration, same impact. These things vary. So it's been useful for us to identify, hey, when you're feeling things, when you're experiencing these things, even though they're universal, when you're feeling them at this frequency, this intensity, this duration, this impact, this is the impact they're having on your life. It's useful for us to categorize those as pathological, which means an illness in this case. Pathology, what we're talking about is things that are injuries or illnesses, right? The things that do impact the human experience. There are humans that are that way, but theoretically it is different than how a human was intended to be, if that makes sense. Doesn't mean that a person is less than, and we might get to that stuff later, depending on how this conversation goes and whether anybody pops in and we go off on different tangents. But no one has a problem calling a cold a disease, right? That's a pathological thing, or the flu, or diabetes, or cancer. These are pathologies. It doesn't mean that a person who's experiencing those things is less than, or deserves them, or chose them, or any of that. Well, what used to happen is when people were experiencing a level of emotional and cognitive or psychological distress, that we generally agree today that we would call pathological, meaning nobody thinks that's how it's meant to be, or that it provides any benefit or advantage, even situationally, to be that way, that we would all like to be able to change that about ourselves if we were experiencing things that way. That's always happened, theoretically, anyway, right? Like it's not, given how evolution works and biology works, it is not likely that humans have recently developed some capacity for some kind of experience that didn't always exist in us. It is quite likely, and everyone is talking about this these days. Everyone has their different theories, but everyone's talking about that it's quite likely that there are changes to the context, which are very new, very recent, which are impacting us in different ways, so that we're we're feeling and thinking and doing and experiencing things that humans have always thought, done, felt, experienced, but at different frequencies in different ways, etc. I think I'm maybe getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let's move back in time. Right now, we talk about this generally as mental health and mental illness. That's kind of the most common consensus way in my culture for us to talk about these things. And we're using those words very specifically because we're relating this to medicine, which is physical. Some of the stuff that has come out of the last, especially century or so, that is just incredibly helpful and incredibly fascinating is how we have learned more and more and more about the nervous system, and in particular the brain, and how that impacts our conscious experience. You got to remember that that's a fairly new idea. We all of us, everyone who's watching this stream right now, I'm guessing, but quite likely, especially if you're showing up for a stream of this nature, all of us have just taken it for granted. We just have known for so long or understood for so long how the brain plays a role in our conscious experience, that being sad can be related to or is related to a certain brain state, right? But that wasn't always known. There's an example of a man named Phineas Gage that was kind of one of the early publicized examples as people were starting to spread this idea that the physical brain impacts your conscious experience, the things you think and that you feel. He was a railroad worker that, in an unfortunate accident, had part of his brain pierced, basically removed, damaged, in such a way that he was able to continue to live, but his personality was notably different. He behaved and thought and felt in patterns that were different to the patterns that he had done before that accident. And so this was I know that name because this is still taught in psychology classes, and to this day as an example of proof that things happening to the brain physically do impact the way that we think and feel. That and all the various specific, and there have been so many specific discoveries involved in that as we've continued to explore that, has been so useful to us, is still so useful, so helpful, and culturally has started to shift things a little bit. So in other words, until very recently, the things that you thought, the things that you felt in terms of emotion, we're talking about two different things. We're talking about the mind, which is your conscious experience, everything you notice. If you can think of it as when you're unconscious, like when you're asleep, anything that isn't happening then, but is happening when you're awake, that's about the mind. The mind is the conscious part of you. The brain is a physical organ. It exists in reality. It is observable while someone is alive. We can only observe it with very specific tools that allow us, and again, those tools are very recent. This is very complicated and advanced technology. But forever we've been able to observe after people have died that there's a brain in there. It's very recent that we've been able to observe anything about what it's doing while a person is alive, and therefore while the brain is still functioning. But we know about the existence of the organ for, I don't know, however long. That brain is a physical organ, like your heart, like a muscle, like your liver, like your hand. It is a piece of your body that exists. The mind doesn't exist in a way that we can observe in reality, right? Like nobody else can see or hear or touch or taste or smell my thoughts. Even I'm aware of my thoughts. I observe my thoughts, but I don't touch, taste, see, hear, or smell them. And I know there's all kinds of discussions about things like aphantasia and all these things where people are exploring this language. What is it, right? When we visualize something, are we seeing it, whatever? And that's fascinating conversations, but we're not seeing it in the sense certainly of that there are photons hitting the rods and cones in our eye and being translated into visual data by our nervous system, right? So we have a mind, we have a brain. The two things are certainly related. We know that now. We know that if you do things to the brain, what happens in the mind shifts. What we can say very, very confidently is that any particular state, if you take a snapshot of what's happening in a person's mind and a snapshot of what's happening in their brain, and then a moment later, take another snapshot and something's different in the mind, something will also be different in the brain. So we can say that some state of the brain, whatever's happening in there chemically, electrically, whatever's happening in the brain correlates to what's happening in the mind. What exactly that relationship is, we're always trying to learn more about it, but there are limits. Again, very helpful. What has happened culturally, though, is we've used language around this. When these ideas were first starting to come out, it was so helpful when we spread them. And now they've spread so much that, like I said, everybody here, in fact, part of the reason I just spent all that time clarifying the difference between the mind and the brain is because at this point, most of us, generally, we don't even think of those as separate things. Even if we intellectually understand that they are separate things, the two things have become so intermixed, so connected in the way that we think about and talk about and interact with them, that it is often hard for people to remember or understand that they're two separate things. That wasn't a thing 200 years ago because nobody had any idea of what the brain was doing in any particular way related to, maybe 200 years isn't long enough, but go far enough back in relationship to what's happening in a person's mind. Remember, very recent that we can observe anything about the brain while a person is still alive to be able to report to us what's happening in their mind. And when a person is dead, we have no access to any information about what's happening in their mind. So we know things now. We have studied and developed things. We know things now that, like, you can take, many of us take medication that changes your psychological state, changes what's happening in your mind, how you feel and what you think. Feel here, talking about, affect, what you're observing in terms of, not feel as in physically feel with your, although that's true actually. As many people know, there are things that we can do, and some of this stuff we've known for a long time, we just didn't know the connection to the brain per se. For example, alcohol, where if you drink alcohol or imbibe enough alcohol, it does impact how your senses even work. There are lots of examples of that. So let's talk about stigma for a second. There's a term, and I can't remember it for the life of me. I'd have to look it up. But there's a phrase in linguistics talking about how when you sub out a problematic word, a word with negative connotations, with a newer word that doesn't have those negative connotations, over time, the new word takes on the same negative connotations that the original word had. So as an example of that, and it's a difficult thing to discuss examples of without using language that has very terrible connotations at this point. But it is worth noting that the term mentally retarded and the shortened version of that, retarded, both of those terms were at one point introduced into usage as the better versions, right? Like the words that didn't have the negative connotations of the words that they were replacing. Over time, people continue to use those words as a sub for the other words, even in the negative ways, and they have taken on the negative connotations to the point where, like, I'm very uncomfortable even saying those words, even in their technical usage, because they are such terrible slurs at this point. They are not something I utilize in my speech. I can't think of the last time I said one or either of those terms before right now. Because what we're talking about is stigma and different approaches to try to remove stigma. So with stigma, what we're talking about is when one person is observing another person, observing something to be true about that other person, and that thing they determine to be a bad thing, undesirable, problematic, whatever, in some way that makes them interact with, it changes the way they think of and feel about and interact with that person in ways that that person wouldn't like. I'm going to just make up a fictional example in order to make it easier to discuss without having to worry about how fraught so much language is around real stigmatized things. Now, do I want to do that, or should I just discuss the actual thing? No, let's discuss an actual thing. So let's talk about fat and fat phobia. A person being fat is not a medical condition, although it is often discussed as though it is. It is an aesthetic description. It's about the shape of a person's body. That's what leads us in this culture to use the term fat to say whether that applies to a person or not. It's as opposed to thin. That has a stigma attached to it. Stigma meaning that people who are perceived to be fat are also thought less of, are treated in less desirable ways, are interacted with in ways that people would not like, that people who are fat do not like. And rightfully, we take a look at these things that we stigmatize, where people are being treated poorly, when we're talking about stigma, we're talking about the portion of whatever it is that person is experiencing negatively, the portion of whatever negative experiences that person is having related to the thing that is stigmatized, that are attributed to the way that other people perceive and interact with that person. So it should be noted that some things which are stigmatized do have inherent negative experiences attached to them, right? Like, as an example, what we're talking about and are intending to come back to when we talk about mental illness, some of the things that are associated with various different versions of what we're calling mental illness are inherently unpleasant and negative. And even if everybody else in the world was to say, like, hey, that doesn't make me think of you any less, it doesn't make me treat you any worse, that person still wouldn't enjoy experiencing it because inherently it doesn't. Now, on top of that is stigma, which is when other people treat that person differently in some negative or unpleasant way because of how they perceive that person. So on top of the inherent unpleasantness of being depressed, there's the way that people perceive you and interact with you if they think of you as a person who has depression. I hope that makes sense. Now, sometimes the thing we are talking about is not inherently unpleasant, and the only issue is the stigma. Fat certainly is one of those things, which isn't to say in all cases that when a person is fat, and I want to be clear that fat is a term that fat activists are very clear about wanting to reclaim and utilize, as though it's not a bad word or a dirty word or a slur to be afraid of or ashamed of. That's why I'm using that term. We'll come back to that in a second, what's going on with that. But I wanted to make that clear because it will make me more comfortable to continue to use it if I'm not as worried that people might think that I am being derogatory in using it, even though I know I'm not, or not intending to come across that way. It is true that for a given individual, being fat may be associated with negative experiences. It is not true that fatness correlates with those negative experiences across the board in some generalized way. In other words, people's bodies are shaped the way that they're shaped, and everybody's bodies are shaped in different ways. And while it is true that there are certain, for example, medical conditions that can result in weight gain, and by the way, there are certain medical conditions that can result in weight loss, which typically those are much scarier. So while it can correlate to those things, that's not fat itself, being fat in and of itself, that is problematic. There are people whose bodies are shaped in a way that we in this culture would call fat, and it has no problematic impact on them unrelated to stigma, meaning it isn't connected to any inherent unpleasant experience or any like medically problematic or disadvantageous experiences, except that it impacts how other people view them and treat them. So one of the things that is difficult for people in exploring this concept with fat in particular is that being fat is also a very stressful experience in our culture because of the stigma. When we control for because there have been many, many studies done that show a clear correlation between being fat, which in the research literature is referred to as being overweight or obese, and some negative, undesirable health outcome. But when we control for stigma, meaning a very common experience, I have had this experience, and I am not a person who generally people would look at and say that fat applies to me. Not never, but not generally. But I have had this experience. I am confident that many of you listening to this, if not most or even all of you, have had this experience of going to a doctor or some medical professional, talking about something that is going on with you, something problematic or unpleasant, and getting the response of, well, you know what? If you lose 20 pounds or if you lose X amount of weight, that issue might be resolved. So why don't you go do that first? If you've lost the weight and the issue doesn't get resolved, then at that point, we'll look further into it. It's a very common response in the medical profession. And you can imagine how that might mean that people who are fat are more likely to have things that are causing problems, medical issues, pathological issues, that get further along before they are detected or addressed. That if a thin person and a fat person are both having the exact same experience and go to a doctor and tell them about the experience, that the thin person might right away, okay, let's look into it, let's figure out what's going on, and then we catch something, we start treating it. And the fat person might be told, well, why don't you lose 20 pounds first, and then if that hasn't cleared up, then we'll start that process. So even if that person goes away and loses 20 pounds, then the process is still started when whatever that condition is further along. But very commonly, it is unreasonable and I would say impossible given the context, not impossible under any given context, but unreasonable and impossible in the given context for a person to do that, certainly for a person to do that within any kind of a short time frame. And so they come back 3 months later complaining of the same thing, or maybe even worse, and are told again, well, if you lose 20 pounds, then it might go away. And these things just go on and on and on. So that's difficult to control for in research. But when people have attempted to control for that, all these correlations disappear. Why am I spending so much time talking about fat phobia and the stigma around fat specifically rather than as an example? I don't know that that's important or, well, I don't know. It is what it is. To this conversation, not that it's not important, but I meant to this conversation for the reason I started bringing it up as an example. Anyway, so stigma. So there's that. There's also the fact that like other things that we know correlate to negative health outcomes, like loneliness, for example, also correlate to being fat because of stigma, not because of some inherent quality of being fat, but because fewer people find fatness desirable in our culture than thinness. And therefore, there's a smaller pool of people when you're talking about physical attraction and romantic relationships, assuming that those things are involved, which they overwhelmingly typically are. There are exceptions, obviously. So there are correlations, and then people will look at those correlations and then reinforce their stigma. What this starts with is, if we're going to be generous and go back far enough, we're going to talk about theoretically where this begins is that someone will look at something that another person is experiencing and come to the conclusion that I would not like it if I were experiencing that thing. In other words, a thin person sees a fat person and thinks, oh man, I would not want to be that. And in this case, there is some validity underlying that thought, because one of the things we're talking about is different people's bodies are shaped differently. And in the same way that it can be very unhealthy for a given individual to go to great lengths, changing their context, their diet, their physical activity, whatever, to make it so that they weigh significantly less than that natural optimal balance state, that the reverse is also true. That if a person changes the context of their life, is eating and behaving in such a way that they are now weighing significantly more than what is that optimal balancing point for them, that can also be correlated with negative experiences and negative health outcomes. So it makes sense that a person who is naturally thin would look at a person who is naturally fat and say, ooh, I would not like that, because there's likely truth to it. It doesn't mean that that's what the other person's experience is, obviously. But as humans, we project. We don't know, we don't have perfect information about what other people's internal subjective experiences are, what's happening in other people's minds. So if I wouldn't like it, I'm going to default to assuming that other people wouldn't like it either. I can understand that someone else might like it, but I need access to specific information about them to understand that. Otherwise, we at all times are defaulting to thinking that other people would respond to things in the same way that we would. That's not self-centeredness or narcissism or any of those other things. It's just literally what it is to be human. You have to operate based on some idea of things, and you have to utilize the ideas that you have until you have access to information that gives you new ideas. And for the most part, these things are fairly safe assumptions, especially when we're talking about like things which are so general that nobody is likely thinking about them as examples of this while I say this. But for example, like, oh, I would not like it if someone punched me in the face randomly. I'm going to assume nobody else would like it if someone randomly punched them in the face. It's a fairly safe assumption, right? Like, such a safe assumption that it seems absurd for me to even point it out, which is showing that we don't think about these things. The number of assumptions we make of that, yeah, I wouldn't like it so somebody else wouldn't like it, or I would like it so somebody else would like it too, are innumerable until it causes some problem. And then we can say, oh, here's a specific instance where I made an assumption, meaning I didn't consciously consider that somebody else might think or feel differently. This thing happened, and now I have new information that gives me reason to think that they do respond differently. Anyway, if we're going to be generous and go back far enough, that's theoretically where stigma initially comes from, is somebody observing someone else's experience and saying, ooh, I wouldn't like it if that was the case for me. And then we kind of shorthand that as being undesirable or bad. And especially in cases where the numbers are, right, where the majority of people think, yeah, I wouldn't like it if that was the case for me, they reinforce that with each other. And so even if the minority of people who do enjoy it or for whom it is not problematic or bothersome are saying, no, this doesn't bother me, this is fine, it becomes very easy for the rest of everybody, the 90% or whatever, to say, yeah, you guys say that, but all of us agree that we wouldn't like it. And these things we then think of over time as bad. Bad is another term that is very useful. It's a tool that's very useful. It's a shorthand. And it can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different cases. It can mean undesirable. It can mean unpleasant. It can mean difficult. It can mean evil. It can mean whatever, right? But anything that we can identify as saying like, oh, I would prefer it if, or generally people would prefer it if X was the case. Well, if X is not the case, then that's bad. Or I would prefer it if Y was not the case. If Y isn't true, I would prefer to avoid Y. We can identify Y as bad. Problem is, as many people might already be identifying, or maybe I'm not sharing this in a very cogent way right now, is that bad also is a term that we use to associate with moral failures. Like I said, evil. And these things get mixed up, right? If there are color words that I can't even name right now, where I have thought of those colors all my life as referring to something in this family of colors. Maybe I'm going to use an example, but I could be wrong about this because that's the whole point, is that I'm wrong about these things. The color chartreuse, when I hear chartreuse, I think of that as being like in the family of like a pinky reddy kind of a color. And I believe that's not actually the case. I think it's meant to refer to something in purple. Or here's one I'm more confident about: scarlet. Or no, crimson. Crimson, whatever. I'm going to stop trying to use these examples. The point I'm trying to make is that there are words that I know and that I've read in books or heard people use and have made some connection with what color I think that that's representing. And then later in life, I find out, oh no, actually that word refers to this kind of a color. And as I'm showing you, it's difficult for me now at this point to even identify what those are, because encoded them inaccurately, or at least differently than most other people did. I was trying to make a bigger, larger point with that, and maybe there's not time for that. The point I was trying to get at is that the language that we use impacts how we encode and remember things. I'm going to say crimson, even though I might be wrong about this. I thought of crimson as like a vibrant, bright red. And I believe that I have since learned that crimson actually refers to a very dark, like purplish red. I believe that the reason I made this mistake is because where I had seen the word crimson used was in reference to blood. And I thought of like fresh, bright blood, but it was being used in reference to like darker, older blood. I'm guessing, reading like fantasy and sci-fi novels and whatever. What that means is that if I when a passage was written that referenced the crimson banners or whatever, the thing I'm picturing in my mind is a bright, vibrant red, when what might have been intended is a dark brownish red. Even more than that is I might be in a situation in which I see a dark brown red, especially because now I have learned that crimson means this different thing. And in that moment, I can think, oh, the walls in here are crimson. And then when I walk away, a day later or 2 days later, what I remember is that the walls were crimson. And I might remember through my new lens that crimson is a dark brown red. Or I might remember the way I've had it encoded for a longer time, which is that it's a bright, vibrant red. And I might, when I picture that room, picture bright red on the wall that does not match the color that's actually there that I experience. With the term bad and related terms, if I use the word bad, this is a bad idea, or that's bad behavior, in a particular moment, I might mean, with unobjectionably, like uncontroversially, I might mean that behavior is detrimental to the person who is doing the behavior, exhibiting the behavior, right? Like an example of this would be if somebody is, I'm coming up with a bunch of examples that are also fraught, and I don't want to use those examples. Apparently, I'm very concerned today about bringing up controversial ideas or topics where people might take offense at the way that I'm using things, understandably, if I'm not careful and deliberate enough about the language I use. All right, we'll say this. A very common and I think uncontroversial example, that a child is going outside in cold weather and it does not take a coat or jacket or sweater, just wearing a t-shirt. We can say fairly uncontroversially, like, that's a bad idea, meaning they will come to regret that. They will likely be very cold and uncomfortable and will wish that they had brought a sweater. So we can say that, and in that moment, we know that that's what we mean by it. Later, though, when we think back, if we have encoded that as, oh, they did that bad thing, when we access that word bad, we might remember it as bad idea, as in they would regret it, it would make their experience unpleasant. But we might remember it instead as something else that bad means to us, like evidence that a person is making poor decisions or is generally poor at making decisions, making good decisions. We might mean it as bad as in rebellious, and now start to think of a person who didn't take a sweater as someone who they never listen. They're always pushing the limits. They think they know everything. I need to go faster. I'm going to run out of time. So we're backing up to stigma, where we can say, well, I would find that unpleasant. And we can understandably think of that as, well, therefore, that's bad. I wouldn't want it. It would be unpleasant. So it must be bad. But then we get that confused with other kinds of bad, like moral failing or weakness or character flaw. And we start to think of that thing as identifying or indicating or defining something about the person that is not what we're observing, but we are thinking that what we're observing indicates is truth. So an example of this would be that when talking about fat phobia specifically, that when people observe someone else that is fat, to associate that with laziness. That is a common part of the stigma around fatness. That people will think, well, there's that thing which is bad, but as I think about it, as time goes on, I'm not thinking about it as I would find it unpleasant. I'm thinking of it definitively as it definitely is unpleasant for everyone, including that other person. And if that person is experiencing something that is unpleasant, there must be some reason for it. And in this case, the only reason, because I don't have difficulty being thin, so I don't think of it as a difficult thing to do. I think of being thin as both desirable and easy. And therefore, if a person is not thin, they are failing to do something which is easy, which makes me think they must be making some bad decisions, or they're not trying at all because I barely have to do anything or do nothing at all. Or they must deliberately be doing things that lead to these bad outcomes for them. So stigma ends up having two pieces associated with it. One is that the thing that I'm stigmatizing is in and of itself bad in some way. The other is that a person for whom that this thing is true must have other things about them which are also bad, because they have allowed this initial bad thing to happen that I wouldn't allow happen to myself. A lot of this has to do with the human mind. We don't have a built-in mechanism that allows us to distinguish. If we're perceiving something, we're perceiving it. If we perceive it happening to us, we're perceiving it. If we perceive it happening to someone else, we're perceiving it. If we perceive it just in imagining it, we're perceiving it. All of those come through perception. So we don't have an inbuilt, categorical thing that allows us to distinguish between something that's happening to us or something that we're just aware of. We do have mechanisms that allow us to do that, primarily logic, and we compare that thing that we're perceiving against other things we're also perceiving. If I perceive that someone is getting hit in the stomach, I am aware that that's not me because I have sensory data coming from my stomach that does not align with what it would feel like to be hit in the stomach. So I'm aware that that's not me. But we all have that response. Humans have that response. When you see somebody else get hit, your first initial response is to flinch. When you watch a show with someone in an embarrassing or awkward or uncomfortable situation, you cringe. That's why we now use the word cringe or cringy in reference to something, because we cringe when we see somebody else doing the thing that we're calling cringy. Or cringe. They don't say cringy anymore, just cringe. So when we see somebody else experiencing something that we think of as unpleasant, it impacts us in an unpleasant way, which means we want to help. Humans have an inbuilt, innate desire to help other people. Now, sometimes that's misplaced because, again, sometimes the thing that I'm responding to as though, oh, that's unpleasant for me, isn't unpleasant for them, and I don't need to help them. And in fact, helping them would be unwanted, right? I'd be butting in on somebody else who likes what they're doing. Well, that becomes very convenient as an explanation for things, right? Because what's happening is I see someone else experiencing something that I would think of as unpleasant. So I have an intrinsic desire to help, but helping is difficult. Even if I know what to do, it requires some amount of my time and energy, some amount of my resources to do the thing. If I don't know what to do, it's even worse, because then I would theoretically have to spend all these resources trying to figure out what to do, much less doing it. So if I can come to the conclusion that actually this person doesn't need my help, that's beneficial. When we see someone else experiencing what we think of as painful, two questions we have automatically is, how did that happen to them? As part of our logic of determining that it isn't happening to me, but also as part of addressing our fear that it might happen to me. And how can I help them? One answer, there are many different versions of the answer, but one thing that answers that very conveniently is to say, The other person wants that. They chose that. If they chose it, well, that's how I know it's not happening to me because I don't want it and I didn't choose it. And it won't happen to me because I don't want it and I'm not going to choose it. So I don't need to worry about that. And I don't need to help them. In fact, even if I attempted to help them, they might be upset at my attempts to help because they chose it. It's what they want. So me trying to help is not only unnecessary, it actually, the most helpful thing I can do is to just not spend any of my resources attempting to change anything for them. And this is often true, right? Like it is often true that someone is listening to music that I don't like, but I can understand, well, they like it. They're choosing to listen to that music. So I don't need to worry about it and I don't need to try and do something about it, right? If I thought that they must dislike that music in the same way I did, then I would think like something must be wrong. Let me see if I like, is their radio broken or whatever, right? But we can also come to that conclusion when it isn't true, that there are times where a person didn't choose a thing and we have just said that they've chosen it because it's a very convenient explanation to assuage our own fears about it happening to us and eliminate the need for us to help them. So stigma often has two pieces. One is this thing that is true of another person's experience is bad in some way. The second is, and they chose it. That doesn't always happen, but it's a very common thing that when we're observing somebody else experiencing something that we think of as bad, that we also then come to the conclusion that they chose it. So we're not helping them. And the more confident we are that this thing is that's bad, that they're experiencing is bad, the more judgmental we become that why would you choose this terrible, terrible thing? And that's awful when it's inaccurate, right? Again, when it's true that someone else chose it and wants it, then it's often good for us to be like, well, different strokes for different folks. I don't need to like interfere. But what that resulted in is a lot of people experiencing unpleasant or difficult or painful things and receiving no help because of the stigma from others that, well, you chose this. And we can either say that as you chose this and therefore that means you want it and you don't want help. Or if you're telling me you don't want it and you do want help, then I can do that one step removed and say, well, you didn't choose this, but this is a consequence of choices that you did make. And I can't help you because you're going to keep making those choices. In fact, we even get to this point of saying, actually, it's helpful for you to experience this terrible thing because that's how you will learn to make better choices, which is a problematic way of thinking. So anyway, especially in the 80s in the United States, there was a big movement of destigmatizing a lot of different things. Unfortunately, those movements were primarily focused on addressing the second part of that stigma, the idea that someone chose it. We're still set on that it's bad, but we've changed the idea that they chose it, which is better because it means that we go from, well, they either don't want our help or helping would just, ameliorate the consequences of their choices, which means they would continue to make bad choices. So helping actually in the long run isn't helpful. You will notice, by the way, there's so many pop psychology concepts, the ones that become very popular, a large number of those ones are some version of a justification for why you shouldn't spend your resources attempting to help somebody else. Don't enable them, don't become codependent, don't be a helicopter parent, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, a lot of different movements in different places that address this second piece, this idea and mental health is one of those. We went from thinking, well, if people are just sad all the time, I'm not sad all the time. I wouldn't want to be sad all the time. So that seems like an unpleasant thing. In this case, they're even telling me it's unpleasant by definition. They're sad. That means that they're not enjoying themselves. So it's a bad thing. And I don't have to do I have not identified having to do any particular or difficult thing in order to be happy or to not be sad to that extent. So I don't understand why they would be, except that they must be choosing it in some way. So that becomes associated with moral failure, character weakness, personality flaws, right? That if you're sad, that's on you. You're just a pessimist. You got to look at the bright side of things. You got to make better choices, right? The movement around mental health and mental illness removed that second stigma and said, look, yeah, it is bad to be sad all the time. Nobody would want to be sad all the time. Not even the people who are sad all the time are arguing that it is a good thing. But let's change this idea that it's in their control and that they chose it, or that they have the opportunity or the ability to choose to experience things differently. Because if we change that, now it goes back to, well, then we should help, which is good. We should help. The same thing happened with fat phobia. The same thing happened with LGBTQIA plus, particularly at that time, primarily focused around homosexuality, especially for men. But all these ideas and narratives of things being genetic, people being born certain ways, things being medical or biological issues. And I want to be clear, again, super helpful. Let's keep it with mental health right now. Not in all cases, but in mental health. Super helpful to start thinking. We get all this research, all this work that is done. We have all these biological interventions, medications, and other procedures at this point that came out of that is undeniably helpful. Not in every case for every person who's experiencing those things, not by a long shot, but many, many people, myself included, utilize some of those interventions and report, by self-report, that it is helpful. That's not up for debate. When we're talking about these things, we're talking about a person's subjective experience, internal subjective reality. Meaning if they say they're sad, they're sad. If they say they're happy, they're happy. Of course, they can lie in reporting that to other people. Any of us can lie. But if what I'm feeling is sadness, if I believe that I am sad, then I am by definition sad. So any response from other people being like, nah, you're not really sad. You just want to be sad or whatever is absurd. So it's great to help in those ways. Problem is that we don't address that first piece, which is that the thing is bad. Meaning some of these times, the thing is not bad. Sometimes it is unpleasant and still beneficial for a person. Fear and anxiety and sadness too often fall under these categories. This is why these are universal experiences, because there's a reason that we are structured in such a way that we're capable of feeling these things. In the same way that there's a reason that we're capable of feeling pain, the sensation of pain. It is useful to us to feel that, even though it's unpleasant. It's useful for us to feel that unpleasant thing. In fact, the fact that it is unpleasant is part of what makes it useful, because we're feeling it in response to something which is happening, and that thing which is happening is damaging or problematic or even potentially fatal for us. And so having an unpleasant experience in response to that draws our attention to the thing and provides incentive for us to attempt to address, change that thing. Now, in the same way that physical pain is a useful thing for us to feel, but sometimes we feel it at times and in ways that isn't useful. For example, sometimes we feel physical pain when what is happening is actually beneficial to us. Like, the first example that came to my mind is when my son had a splinter, and getting that splinter out was painful for him. When we're digging the splinter out, it's painful, but we can all agree, I would assume, maybe there are people who disagree with this, but I'm unaware of it. We can all agree that it is beneficial to a person's body to take the foreign object, the splinter, out of their body rather than to leave it in. So there are times where the thing that causes us pain is actually a beneficial thing. And there are other times where the thing that's causing us pain isn't beneficial, but the pain is no longer useful, meaning it has fulfilled its role of drawing our attention to the thing. We are sufficiently incentivized to address the thing. We are in the process of doing everything that we can do to address the thing. At that point, the pain is no longer useful. And that's when we're using painkillers in medicine, right? The good thing that somebody feels pain because it gets them into the doctor to get checked out. And then we find it, we figure out what it is, and we're addressing it. And the pain is no longer necessary or helpful. We found the thing and we're doing what we're doing. So we give pain medication so that you don't have to deal with the unpleasantness. The same is true of unpleasant emotional and cognitive experiences, that there are times where the thing which is happening that we, in response to that thing, are feeling anxious or sad or scared or angry or whatever unpleasant experience, is actually beneficial. And for some reason, you have misinterpreted, misunderstood it, or there are some hardwired kind of instinctual responses to it that we're responding to it as though it's something that is bad for us, even though it is in reality good for us. There are other times where the thing that we're responding to is problematic, and us feeling badly in some way in response to that thing is beneficial because it draws our attention to it and it incentivizes us to address it. But we're already doing everything we can do to address it. In some cases, there's really nothing we can do. And at that point, the feeling is no longer useful. The idea behind the concept of mental health and mental illness is that we're doing our best. This is the idea of that paradigm, is that we collectively are doing our best to identify the differences between when it is that what you're feeling is proportionate and warranted and beneficial in response to whatever it is, so that it draws your attention and incentivizes you to address the thing. But that we're acknowledging that sometimes people have experiences where that unpleasant experience isn't beneficial to them, and we're defining that as being pathological. Primarily, we're defining it as being pathological in that first way, meaning that the thing that is causing you to feel anxious or sad or whatever is not actually problematic, and therefore your response is unwarranted. Or the intensity and the extent to which you are having a negative experience, even though the thing that you are responding to is problematic, that the problem of it is a small one, and your response to it is as though it is a very large one, so it's disproportionate. So that's the concept, is that we can identify that people's responses are sometimes pathological, and we're trying to find and identify those cases. So what we're then saying about people who suffer from major depressive disorder, for example, is, well, they're responding to things that are, everyday occurrences or day-to-day, whatever, as though they are much more problematic than they really are. Or they're responding to things which aren't problematic or are even beneficial as though they are problematic. And that's not great. So we want to learn how to adjust and change that response. That's the idea. And there's merit to that. Again, I hope I have said enough times that this is a useful idea, a useful way of looking at things. But it becomes problematic when it becomes conflated with other things. In other words, we then start to think of these mental, cognitive, emotional experiences as though they are the same as physical and biological ones. Partly because we understand that there is some correlation between the biology and the experience, and partly because we are, as we've talked about just now, we have found it to be useful to use that paradigm of pathology in discussing some of these experiences, which is something that we talk about with medicine. If something's pathological, the idea is to cure it, to treat it, so that we can eliminate it. Well, sometimes, and depending on what disorder we're talking about, sometimes we're talking about things which do impact us in unpleasant and negative ways in some contexts, but impact us in beneficial ways in other contexts. This is what the concept of neurodiversity comes out of, is a response to the medical model, the idea of saying that we can identify that a person is mentally healthy or mentally ill, one or the other. We can draw a boundary around what is mental health or mental wellness, and as long as people, their experiences, their thoughts, behaviors, feelings, whatever, as long as they remain within these boundaries, that's healthy, appropriate, good, natural, normal, whatever word you want to use. And any experience or behavior or thoughts or whatever outside of those boundaries is pathological. And the idea is to identify those, do what we can to get people back within those boundaries, which again, useful in many cases. Nobody, neurodiversity or otherwise, nobody is making the argument that no people would ever want to change any of their patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. There are many, many, many people. In fact, I would say pretty much everybody could identify at least something about that they want to change. But certainly there are things where we could collectively, including the person who's experiencing it, all look at it and say, Man, that really sucks. We wish that that was different. There are other times, though, like with autism in particular. That's why this neurodiversity started with autism, or started in that community, where what we're talking about is something that causes distress under certain contexts, and in certain contexts, causes problems, interferes with a person's ability to live their life the way that they would want to live it in certain contexts. But in other contexts is not in any way problematic, and in other contexts is actually preferable and beneficial. With autism specifically, just as one particular example of this, talk about special interests, right? That autistic people are not complaining about the fact that they enjoy engaging with their special interests as much as they do. So we can acknowledge that there are downsides and upsides to being a certain kind of a way. And all of this is complicated. But the idea of health, mental health, and mental illness is simple, very useful, and simple. And so it is very appealing for us to all answer those questions, right? Well, that person's experience is something I wouldn't enjoy experiencing. So how did it happen to them so I can make sure it doesn't happen to me? And how do I help them? Well, if it's biological, if it is medical, then how it happened to them is just luck of the draw, right? Especially if what we're talking about is heredity and genetics, meaning it's not like a disease that you can catch. It's just something you're born that way. So I don't need to worry about ever happening to me because I'm not that way. So I wasn't born that way. They were just born that way. This is why you'll see so much in these spaces, in these conversations, so much focus on genetics, on people's brains being wired differently, people being predestined or foreordained to go a certain direction, that there's nothing they could do or anybody could do. It's just how they were born. That was a lot more problematic when it was attached to an idea that that's how somebody is and they chose it. It's much better to say that's how somebody is and they didn't choose it, because now we're helping at least. But we over-applied it. So the fact that we're all talking about this as though it is mental health and mental illness is problematic. It's a useful way of looking at things when we're talking about people who are researching and developing ways to identify and address these experiences. It's useful when we're talking about people whose job is to identify and to determine what these experiences are, and and then enact whatever interventions or treatments can be utilized. It is not useful for lay people, for us just walking around talking about things in our day-to-day life, to talk about it as mental health and mental illness. It is fundamentally different. I know that I am sick, physically sick, because I woke up today and my experience is different than it typically is, right? I felt a pain when swallowing that I do not typically feel. Now, we're over time. I want to go down other paths, but I shouldn't. When it's done, I will know, because my throat will no longer be hurting. And this is not something that occurs in certain contexts. We do have stuff like that. This is the thing I said I wasn't going to go down, but maybe I'll open it up a little bit. We do have some things like that, especially in what we call allergies or autoimmune responses, where every time I'm in a particular context, I have that response. That's an allergy. We don't call that an illness, because it isn't. It's different mechanisms. Even though the other part that I wasn't going to open up is that most of the symptoms that we experience when we are ill in any way are actually the experience of our immune system fighting off the illness, not the result of the illness in and of itself. It's mostly stuff that our body is doing in order to eliminate the illness. Obviously not all, but we're talking about the common experiences. So anyway, we can separate these things out. We can test these things, right? If my throat is sore and my nose starts running and I'm coughing, We can say, okay, well, that's unusual and unpleasant. I don't want to experience it. If we think it might be a response to the context, well, then we can just change the context, right? Like I remove myself from that thing that I'm exposed to and see, does it keep happening or does it stop? If it stops, then there's we can be more thorough and blah blah. I'm shorthanding some stuff here, but if it stops, then we can identify, okay, that is a response. It's an autoimmune response, an allergic response to a thing, and we have to address the context. And when people have allergies, while we do have medication and interventions, procedures that we can utilize to try and help with those allergies, we also do what we can do to remove the allergen, the thing to which they're having the allergic response, from their context, right? That if somebody has a big peanut allergy, we make sure that we don't expose them to peanuts, even though we're also going to make sure they have an EpiPen and do other things to address it however we can for the individual. When it's an illness, when we're removed from the context and it continues, then it's an illness, and we address that differently, because what that means is even though it is still a response to some context, that context is internal. It's in my body, not external. It's still physical environment. It's observable. We can look and see what's called the pathophysiology. We can see the flu virus in there or whatever. We can count the level of the insulin. But it's internal to my body. So changing the context, changing the environment and what I'm exposed to won't change it. We can and do, this is what medical treatment then is that we attempt to address and treat the context internal to the body that is causing the problematic experience. But illness follows you around. It's internal to you. It's not about what's happening outside of you. No, some illness, like diabetes as an example, changes the way that you respond to external things. In other words, diabetes means that you respond to sugar intake differently than you would if you weren't diabetic, in a way that we all agree is pathological, meaning undesirable. There's not a situational benefit to that. So the context, the external context, can still impact that, but only by what's going into your body. And it's because of mechanisms internal to your body. When we think of mental illness that way, it's unhelpful, because mental illness is never that. While it is certainly, I was going to say true's not the right word. We have so much evidence to suggest, to reinforce the idea that there are things which are internal to a person's body that impact how they respond to things. That's why medication has the impact that it has on people. And by the way, anybody out there who is opposed to the idea of psychiatric medication, anything that people can do that impacts their subjective internal experience, their emotional state, their cognition, all falls under this category. And yes, that includes illicit substances, alcohol, drugs, whatever. But also, all of us know that when we're really hungry and we haven't eaten in a long time, we think and feel differently than after we've just eaten. When we slept terribly, we think and feel differently than after we've slept well. There are definitely biological components, biological variables that impact all of this. And it could even be, it seems to be true, that some people's systems are set up in the same way that some people's immune systems are set up, where an allergic response is an immune system response to something which isn't actually pathogenic, meaning dander isn't actually going to make you sick and kill you the way that some virus might, but your body is responding to it as though it is something that might make you sick and kill you. Interestingly, we can have these kinds of responses even when it is not purely biological. The fact that you can vomit when you are feeling disgust because of your idea of something is proof that your concepts, your ideas, your psychology can trigger immune responses. When you think of something disgusting to that extent and then vomit, that's vomiting is an attempt to protect your body from whatever the damage the disgusting thing might do to it by having it in your body. All this stuff is so fascinating and so complicated. And it's just one of these kind of inevitable things where it's so useful and helpful for us to have people whose focus, their professions, their work, whatever, is dedicated to exploring these things and finding ways to make them useful. And then that stuff bleeds out into the public consciousness, and people who aren't focused on those things get some version of it, some simplified version of it, and then start utilizing it in a way that is problematic. Behavior is the only way that we can know about anybody's internal experience. Each of us observes our own internal experience, but you can only know anything about mine because of my behavior, which includes my statements, things I say. That's also behaviors. Behavior is anything your body is doing. Creating sound is something your body's doing. Behavior is multivariate, meaning I could take anybody, and if I knew enough about them and had enough control over the context that they are in, I could make them feel miserable. I could make them feel terrified. I could make them feel ecstatic, right? We can do this with anybody. So it's not that there are no variations from one individual to the next. There obviously are. And it's not that there are no biological components to that. There obviously are. And it's not that none of those variations result in demonstrably, including by self-report, unpleasant experiences that people would rather change. That obviously happens as well. The part of the thinking that is flawed is the idea that this is all internal to a person, like a disease, which no matter what we change about the external context, what's happening inside your body is the same. That is never the case with things that we're talking about as mental health, mental illness, disorders, emotions, thoughts. Never. Everything is in response to the context. How we respond to that context changes, and how we respond to that context can be problematic or even pathological if we want to use that way of thinking about it. It's also true that there are things where it could be, as a common example, height is something that has a bell curve, a normal distribution among humanity, because what that means theoretically is that for humans, it has been beneficial to human communities to have most people at about the average height, with people being taller and people being shorter, but the further and further and further from that average height, the fewer of those people exist. What that means is that as somebody who is very tall, there are situations in which it is beneficial for me and for any community I'm a part of for me to be tall. It makes me well suited to things, makes certain things easier for me than they would be for someone who is less tall than I am. So it's useful for our community to have a specialist where those things are easier. There are other things where it's the opposite, where the taller I am, the less well suited I am to the thing. And the shorter somebody is, the better suited they are, and it is beneficial to our community to have a member who is short and therefore able to do those things more easily than the rest of us can. All of this relies on the idea that we are operating in community with one another. So that's one of the big problems, is a lot of these things do become primarily or even completely disadvantageous if a person is not in the context of a community where they're doing certain things and other people are taking care of the things that they are not well suited for. Because these things are situationally advantageous and disadvantageous. They make some things easier and more pleasant, and some things more difficult and more problematic, more painful, more uncomfortable. Which works great if you and I are working together and I'll do the stuff that's pleasant for me, and because you're different than me, you'll do the stuff that's pleasant for you, and we each benefit. But we remove that, community becomes a problem. This is part of the social model of disability. It is also problematic if, even if we are in community, we have shifted the context such that every member of a community has to do certain things, or that certain things are unavoidable in many ways, right? Like that you're going to come into contact with it over and over and over and over. For example, in our culture, all children start going to school at 5 years old, more or less, rare exceptions. If there are things about a person, if there's a variable trait like height or something like that, that makes a person better suited for the things that one has to do, or the things that one encounters in the academic environment, at the cost of making them less well suited to other things, Well, the fact that they're in school so much is really beneficial to them. They get to focus on the things and experience the things that they're well suited for. If a person is structured in such a way that the things that we encounter in the academic environment are unpleasant and difficult, that they're poorly suited for those things while being well suited for other different things, that's terrible for them, that they're still in a context where they're going to be at school 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So the shifting context matters, and everybody knows this. It's kind of one of my favorite and least favorite things to observe is people will sit and complain about, oh, everybody else is making these excuses for why they feel this or why I feel that. Everyone thinks social media is ruining stuff, but really it's this other thing. Or everybody thinks that, it's boomers that are ruining things, but it's actually social media or whatever. Everybody has their thing that they complain about what has changed in the context that has made something worse. If you identify that something is worse, not everybody agrees on what things might be worse. But if you see something that you think of as worse than it used to be, everybody immediately starts to think about what is it in the context that has shifted things to make them worse. And that can be language, ideas, right? Like, oh, it's just because everybody thinks it's so cool to whatever these days. Whatever, that's still context. And it's quite common for people to point at other people's explorations of this and be like, they're looking to make excuses about the context. And then we'll immediately turn around and say, but really it's this thing, which is also a statement about the context. I guess I shouldn't go further into that. Maybe it would be calling certain things or people out. But for you out there who are not in the business of, who are not dedicated to, focused on furthering our ability to identify and intervene with unpleasant or pathological or problematic or harmful or unhelpful experiences, for those of you, which is most of you, it's not useful for you to think about it as illness and health. Because I'm sick right now, and I don't want to be sick anymore. Because that's what it is to be sick. Nobody thinks of it as, this is something which is beneficial to me. It just sucks. Had this not happened to me, I wouldn't be worse off. I'd be better off. Given that there's something in my body that my immune system is having to fight off, I'm glad this is what's happening because it means that it's fighting it off. But I wish it wasn't necessary. And I'm excited for when I will no longer be feeling sick. It is also true that when I am sad or anxious, I don't like it. And I'm excited for when I will no longer feel sad or anxious. But if I make the mistake of thinking that like illness, that means that whatever it is causing that is purely internal to my body, it has to be something about me, can't be about the context, then I'm missing out on so much information. I'm barking up the wrong tree. And it causes all kinds of, I shouldn't say barking up the wrong tree, because again, there can be things explored that way that are helpful, but I'm definitely missing other things. Even if you believe that depression is purely biological in origin, which is logically indefensible. But even if you accept that, you would still have to acknowledge that for a person who is depressed, who is biologically structured in such a way that they are depressed, their experience still changes from moment to moment. They are not the exact same level of depressed every single moment of every day. There are times when they're more depressed. There are times where they're less depressed. Even people who are adamant that they are biologically depressed will state that sometimes they feel happy, sometimes they feel joy, which doesn't mean that we should ignore addressing the fact that it's a larger pattern and whatever, but it is to say that there must be contextual factors. There must be variables about what is happening in a person's life and around them and how they're perceiving and thinking about things that impact that stuff. All of us have things that we like and things that we don't like. A lot of those things we all universally feel the same way about, or more or less universally. But many of those things are individual. There are things that I enjoy that you wouldn't. There are things that you enjoy that if I had to do it, I would hate it. It isn't just biological. And if you go about trying to address what we're calling mental illness in the same way that you address illness, at best, it impedes your process. You can still make progress, you can still improve, but you would always be able to determine or evaluate or explore more things and come to more useful conclusions if you opened up your idea to there being a context. This isn't every experience that every person has ever had is the result of an interaction between that person and the context in which the experience arises. It is true that if a different individual was in that same context, they would have a different experience. It is also true that if that same individual was in a different context, they would have a different experience. Both things matter. And yes, it is absolutely worth looking at changing things about the individual so that their responses to the context are better. Whatever that means, more pleasant, more beneficial, whatever. It is also worth looking at the context and exploring what changes could be made to the context so that the person's experience is better, whether that means more pleasant, more beneficial, or whatever. Don't focus just on one or the other. It sucks that I'm sick. It's not that big a deal, but it sucks. I'd prefer not to be. And it serves no purpose for me. It sucks when I'm sad. And maybe sometimes it's not serving a purpose for me, but sometimes it is. It's very difficult for us to be able to evaluate when one is the other or whatever. So this false binary that people have developed where some people are saying, no, this stuff is purely genetic and inborn and biological and nothing can be done about any of it except for medical and biological interventions is absurd. Not that that stuff is helpful, that's not absurd, but that's exclusively what can be helpful. And the response that many people have to that of saying, no, that's absurd, those medications just numb you out or make the problem worse, or you're just looking for excuses, what needs to happen is you need to make changes in your life, is also absurd to say that there's nothing over here that would be helpful. And this, by the way, can take two different forms commonly. One of those is people are just weak and they're lazy and they're not trying hard enough. And if they worked harder and did better things and made better choices, they'd be happier. The other is the society, the culture, the context around a person is broken and terrible and harmful. And that's the thing that causes all of the problems. There's truth under those things. I certainly, if I had to pick one of them, I would pick one more than the other. And other people have their own feelings about that. But you don't have to. You can take from all of them. You can look at biological interventions. You can look at interventions about the individual that aren't biological in nature. You can look at interventions about the physical environment and about the context. This doesn't need to be a fight between different ways of looking at this. Just like we don't need to fight about whether a hammer or a saw is a better tool. If we get specific, which one's a better tool for putting a nail through two pieces of wood? Yeah, there's a clear answer there. And anybody who says it's the saw, I think is misinformed, and I will do my best to educate them for their benefit, as well as for the benefit of anybody else who might be listening and learning from them. Or if there's anybody who's saying that that a hammer is a better tool for sawing or cutting a piece of wood in half, they're misinformed, and I will argue with that for the same reason, to benefit them and anybody who's listening and learning from them. But if someone's just saying that one's a better tool, what a ridiculous argument. I'm not going to get involved with that. It's impossible to quantify. It's unuseful, even if it were possible to quantify. So having broad, general conversations about what is or is not mental illness or neurodiversity, what counts as neurodivergence or not, I understand it. I don't find it to be an incredibly useful way to be spending our resources. I think those are useful questions when we get specific and talk about specific individuals, specific experiences, specific contexts. Then it's very important and helpful to identify whether things are biological or pathological or not. But in a broad way, what a waste. So if and when somebody is saying that a particular person is only sad because they want to be sad, yeah, I'll debate that for that person's benefit and the benefit of anyone listening and learning from them. By the way, I might be wrong about these things, but as all people, I have to do the best I can do to come to the conclusions that I think are correct, while being aware of the fact that I don't know everything, so that I'm open to new information when some new information is presented to me. But in the meantime, I have to do everything I can to be as helpful and effective as possible, given the understandings that I currently have. Otherwise, I'm sitting around doing nothing. So if somebody says that somebody else, that if somebody tells me that they're only sad because they don't work hard enough, again, not a general thing. Maybe there are instances in which that's worth exploring, but if I'm working a specific, this isn't, I'm going to use an example that isn't a specific thing that a person has said to me, but for confidentiality reasons, but as an example where I've changed some meaningless details, and it's real things that people have said other than the meaningless details. If somebody is saying to me that I couldn't sleep last night, I was just crying in my bed all night long because I wasn't working on that song that I need to be working on, and I know that I just don't want it enough, and I just need to try harder, and I don't know what's wrong with me, why I'm not doing that, then I'm going to argue against that, because that's absurd. Nobody is awake in bed crying all night over their inability to do something or their failure to do something that doesn't care about it, and caring more about it obviously is not the solution, because you care so much about it that you were crying all night instead of sleeping. That didn't help. I don't know why I'm on about all this. This stuff matters to me. I think it has to do with responsibility and other things, but I really should be going. I've been talking too much, and it's a half hour past when this is supposed to wrap up. It's good to be with you all. I hope I feel better soon. I hope everybody feels good, both physically, emotionally, cognitively, and that in whatever ways that you don't, that changes and improves for you as quickly and as much as possible. Good to be with you all. See you next month.